Want to give a massive shout out to the Platinum sponsors, BDC for the generous support. Everybody BDC, let's go for BDC. We love you, BDC. Come on up, panel. Come on up, panel. We are good to go. From EDC, Donna, are we good to go? Let's hear it for the panel.
Good morning, everyone. Hello and welcome to the 2025 Indigenous Prosperity Forum. We are thrilled to open up with this event with an esteemed panel to discuss a topic that's been on everybody's mind lately for the last few months. It starts with T. Can you guess what it is? It's trade, not tariffs, not yet, okay? Good morning, my name is Donna St. I am the National Lead for Indigenous Business with Inclusive Trade at Export Development Canada. I'm a member of the Coldwater Indian Band, or part of the Unpack Nation, and that's from British Columbia, if you're not aware. So I'm really pleased to be here with you today. I'm going to start by asking each of our wonderful panelists to introduce themselves. And maybe we can start over at the far end with Leanne.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Bonjour. I'm Leanne Herman. I'm the Executive Director for Intergovernmental Relations, Regional Networks and Targeted Trade Support at Global Affairs Canada. My division is responsible for inclusive trade, promotion, and engagement. That means that we work with Indigenous businesses to support their expansion into international markets. I'm a career Foreign Service officer, and prior to this current position, I was our Canada's ambassador to Burkina Faso and Benin in West Africa. I've also been posted to Zimbabwe, Ivory Coast, Germany, and Lao PDR in Southeast Asia. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and I'm very thankful to be able to sit on this esteemed panel, and I really look forward to the discussions, and thank you so much to NACA for inviting me to be here. Thanks.
Thanks, Leanne. Richard, would you go next?
Mai te rangi ki te whenua ki te rangi, ka riri ngā mihi ki a kōtau o tēnei o ngā whenua. Kei te tautoko i ngā mihi, ngā wehi tata nei ki tō tātou matu nui te rangi o te rāna atua o tēnei whenua, ngā atu o tātou whenua. Nō reira he mihi nui hoki ki a kōtau te hau kāinga o tēnei whenua e nō nei tātou. O ti rā ki mihia hoki rātou kei tū o pairau, rātou nā mati nā rātou anō i taka i tēnei o ngā whenua i roti nātou. Ko tātou nei te hunga ora e whai nei o rātou nei tapu ai, nō reira he mihi kauke ki a koe. Nā maunga tapu, nā wā tapu, nā wāhi tapu o tēnei o ngā whenua, kei te mihia. Kei te tautoko hoki, kei te mihi hoki atu ki tō tātou kuia, tō tātou kaumātu i whakarite nei a tātou i tēnei ata. Kia ora tātou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Really pleased to be here, and in our language, it's always important for us to start by acknowledging our gods, the Creator, and our history, which comes down from the Creator. I also want to acknowledge the people of this land, these sacred mountains, these sacred rivers. We say when we come to a new area, it's our mountains giving greetings to your mountains, our rivers giving greetings to your rivers. I also want to acknowledge our elder who gave up words of offering to the Creator this morning, and want to endorse those words. My name is Richard Jefferies. I'm a Māori from Aotearoa, from New Zealand. I descend from Ngāti Raukawa and Ngāti Tūkorehe tribes, and I've been lucky enough to be a part of, in a small way, the substantive development in the Māori world really just over the last 30 or 40 years. I'm a Māori development consultant, so I've worked as a consultant for government and to our people for the last 30 to 35 years. I've provided services to Māori business, not dissimilar to some of the work that NACA does. I've done policy work within government, and more recently been involved with promoting the NACA model as a really good model for use in New Zealand. Still found no success with our government, but still plugging away there, trying to promote what is a fantastic model of Indigenous business development. Also, since about 2012, I've been attending conferences like these in a number of countries, trying to promote and find ways in which we as Indigenous peoples can do more business together. So really thankful that NACA invited me over to this conference this week, and really pleased to meet you all, and look forward to the discussion. Kia ora tātou.
Thank you, Richard. Over to you, Senator.
My name is Senator P.J. Prosper. I'm honored to be here, taking part in this incredible event, and being here on this host territory. I want to recognize Elder Vera, the Spirit Wolf Singers, the ceremony that we have had starting off in this way is really truly an honor for me. As mentioned, I am a senator, a somewhat recent senator, just maybe over a year and a half. But prior to that, I do have a legal background, and then through that was a chief previously within Buckingham Mi'kmaq Nation, and then had the honor to work with now National Chief, but then Regional Chief at the Assembly of First Nations. Incredible experience there. My work in the Senate more recently has been dealing with a host of Indigenous issues on the Indigenous Peoples Committee, also involved with the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee. Certainly, as you can imagine, it's a bit of a passion for me to bring these issues forward and to advocate on behalf of all First Nations, Indigenous people across this country. So very honored and thankful for the invite to be here. Thank you, Walalio.
Thank you, everyone, for your introductions. Let's get started. So, with recent political shifts, trade and market diversification, I think, is on everyone's mind. But what many of us may not know in the audience is that Canada, in partnership with Indigenous people, has been working on diversification for trade for many years now. And a major milestone in that work is the Indigenous Peoples Economic and Trade Cooperation Agreement, also known as IPETCA. How many here have heard of IPETCA before? That's a decent number. A lot more of you are going to be raising your hands at the end of this session. But I think what we really want to understand from our panelists today is how can you help us better understand IPETCA? How have we arrived here, and what does the future hold from your perspectives? Leanne, perhaps we can start with you on this.
Great, thanks very much. To start off, IPETCA is a unique arrangement. And maybe I should say in your swag bags, we've left a one-pager on IPETCA. So if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, please take the time. But I'll explain a little bit about what it is and where it comes from. So it's an Indigenous-led and government-enabled. And it brings together Indigenous and government representatives from 4 economies: Aotearoa, New Zealand, Australia, Chinese Taipei, and Canada. And Canada is one of the founding members of IPETCA, and we endorsed the arrangement in 2021. There are 2 main objectives for IPETCA: to promote Indigenous participation in international trade, and to foster people-to-people connections with Indigenous peoples around the world. IPETCA is not, and I must stress that is not a traditional trade agreement with market access commitments, but it can play a role to help Indigenous peoples explore new trade opportunities during these uncertain times. It creates a forum for Indigenous peoples in Canada to collaborate with Indigenous peoples in New Zealand, Australia, and Chinese Taipei, and hopefully with more Indigenous economies in the future, to share leading practices, shape policy, and open conversations on how Indigenous trade can be boosted. I want to emphasize the innovative structure of IPETCA and the important role that Indigenous peoples in Canada played in its negotiation. And I see that Dale is in the room, and he was part of that original negotiation on IPETCA, so thank you for all your work on setting things up for us. Negotiations on IPETCA began in 2020. It was envisioned by former New Zealand Foreign Affairs Minister Mahuta as a legacy instrument for Maori and Indigenous peoples in APEC economies that would enhance trade and grow economic cooperation led by Indigenous communities. Canada was there from the very beginning. Global Affairs Canada, ISC and CERNAC worked closely with Indigenous partners through a dedicated working group on trade to develop the Canadian position. Negotiators concluded in the fall of 2021 and Canada endorsed this historic arrangement soon thereafter. IPETCA is innovative because it established the Partnership Council as an operating body where each member economy would be represented by Indigenous representatives and government representatives, collaborating side by side to co-develop and implement cooperation activities. The First Nation representative for Canada is Regional Chief Joanna Bernard. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to make it today, but we also work very closely with Sasha Labilwas, who I think is still here in the room, and the team at AFN. We also work with the Métis National Council and ITK, the other two Indigenous organizations. I want to highlight some of the milestones that we have achieved on IPETCA to date. In 2023, we finalized the terms of reference for the IPETCA Partnership Council that will govern how it operates. And during the first Partnership Council meeting in San Francisco in 2023, that's just 2 years ago, discussions were also launched on the development of a work plan. And the current 2024-26 work plan focuses on the following areas for sharing knowledge and leading practices. Trade, environment, and sustainability is one pillar. Elevating Indigenous trade policy and practice is a second pillar. And the third pillar is connecting Indigenous business and entrepreneurs. The implementation of IPETCA focuses on developing tangible and valuable cooperation activities among member economies. These can take the form of workshops, webinars, conferences, trade missions, and joint research projects. The first IPETCA cooperation activity took place in October 2024, a webinar where each economy presented a domestic scan of their trade and investment policies and programs supporting Indigenous businesses. This information would be compiled into a compendium and made available to IPETCA economies. Last fall, an Indigenous delegation from Canada participated in the second in-person meeting of the IPETCA Partnership Council in Peru, where Indigenous representatives built on tangible connections and engaged with senior officials and ministers from APEC economies to raise the visibility of Indigenous issues. I was fortunate enough to be there at that meeting, and it was a real pleasure to see how the collaboration and cooperation between our Indigenous peoples is close and collaborative, and the similarities and the way that we can work together really stood out to me. Canada's then Minister of International Trade, Mary Ng, was also present at APEC and sat side by side with Regional Chief Bernard at the APEC Ministerial Dialogue on Indigenous Peoples, focused on Indigenous perspectives on inclusive growth and economic empowerment. Currently, progress is underway to organize other cooperation activities to share knowledge and strengthen relationships, notably on the margins of the World Expo in Osaka during Indigenous Peoples Week, the Te Aratini Week, in August. Canada will lead a cooperation activity on the promotion and protection of Indigenous intellectual property, traditional knowledge, and cultural expression, together with the AFN, MNC, and ITK, and also the other economies. Over time, we hope that IPETCA can grow and include more Indigenous economies around the world, in Europe, in the Indo-Pacific, Latin America. IPETCA is still a relatively new instrument, and it has a lot of unfulfilled potential. And having opportunities like today to speak to you all about what IPETCA is and what it can do is really important, because we need to get that message out there about IPETCA and how we can use it as an arrangement to support that people-to-people ties and also try to promote trade. We hope to organize more and more cooperation activities that would help Indigenous businesses and communities explore new markets. IPETCA's value is in its focus on cooperation and collaboration, its ability to bring together Indigenous peoples around the world. We're excited about the future, about what we can do to build on the foundation of this innovative arrangement, and working with Indigenous partners to realize full potential. So I look forward to discussing more about IPETCA, and thank you all for listening, and pass on that message that IPETCA is there to help us to expand our market diversification and also those people-to-people ties. Thanks.
Thank you, Leanne. I think you brought up a really good point in having to, spread the word about IPETCA, which brings me to my next question for Senator Prosper. You recently wrote an op-ed for the Hills Times that IPETCA is not widely known to the Indigenous business circle. From your point of view, why should the Indigenous business community be aware of IPETCA?
Thank you, Donna. IPETCA is, I want to recognize Canada because it is a major milestone for Canada. And I think the next step, and some of the elements that's just outlined by Leanne here, is to fully operationalize it. We all know, and Elder Vera mentioned today about being at a crossroads, and she referenced those two diamonds coming together, and certainly we are in a climate of shifting political reality, geopolitical realities, and the need to diversify markets for all businesses. And so, as mentioned, IPETCA is Indigenous-led and government-enabled. It seeks to identify and reduce barriers through trade cooperation activities to strengthen Indigenous relations and promote economic development. It provides that opportunity for Indigenous businesses to connect directly through participating economies, as mentioned. Key and an integral component to that is the Partnership Council itself. And it does many important things. It can determine a certain observer status, which can be an economy, an Indigenous nation, businesses, other organizations. It can also include non-Indigenous businesses or organizations that support Indigenous peoples. The Partnership Council can also invite experts, Indigenous leaders, elders, knowledge keepers to also participate. Leanne mentioned the work plan, which is an excellent example of the focus of sharing knowledge and best practices. Through the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business and Global Affairs Canada, they released a series of 3 reports beginning in 2019 that looked at Indigenous firms and international trade. The third report in that series, and I hopefully won't get this wrong, Adami Towin? The phonetics with Mi'kmaq, I'm hoping, are quite similar to Algonquin. Identifying and overcoming challenges facing Indigenous exporters. There were 5 priority areas listed, but basically a lot of them rested on the need for increased people-to-people connections, of which IPETCA is a classic example to support this. And certainly great things can happen when Indigenous people connect with each other. Since IPETCA is Indigenous-led and government-enabled, the government should enable more opportunities for Indigenous business-to-business connections. However, it's just not IPETCA. There are other avenues to pursue other free trade agreements and treaties to support Indigenous international trade, like the Jay Treaty, the Mercosur Agreement, CETA, which is the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between the EU and Canada, CUSMA, and many others. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Senator. You spoke about IPETCA providing opportunity for Indigenous businesses to connect with Indigenous businesses in the partnering countries or the participating countries. Richard, I imagine there's a lot of common ground between Indigenous business communities in New Zealand and Canada. From your experience, in international trade and with IPETCA, how can we mobilize Indigenous to Indigenous business?
Kia ora. Yes, first I'd just like to acknowledge former Minister Nanaia Mahuta, who was mentioned as the instigator of the work for the establishment of IPETCA. She was also almost single-handedly responsible for bringing social procurement for Māori to New Zealand, and she made a great contribution. She's no longer a parliamentarian, and I was with her a couple of weeks ago, so I'll send back her regards from this conference. I like to talk about us. It's great to have the governments providing opportunities and enabling more contact between us. And so it's great to see IPETCA and other pieces of work going on to allow that. Governments have been talking to each other about us for years and working with each other about us. And this is a step forward in terms of actually involving us in those discussions. But I think one of the real challenges is for us to be talking to each other more Indigenous to Indigenous. And IPETCA is important because it helps enable some of that. At home, most of our trade missions offshore are industry-based, so as you'd be aware, we are a country that relies almost totally on external trade for our economy, and is primarily focused on in the primary produce areas: dairy, red meat, kiwi fruit, wine, all the things that grow. So generally in our country, the trade missions have been industry-based, which is good, but in recent years, Māori have been asking for their own trade missions. And so I think under IPETCA, these are the kinds of opportunities that we're going to be able to mobilise, opportunities that we weren't given in the past. So I think it's fantastic now that we have a framework within which we can work more closely together and develop an important missing ingredient, which is actually connecting Indigenous businesses between these different countries. I also just wanted to take a step back and talk about some of the fundamental challenges and opportunities for us as Indigenous people working in trade. During the time of early contact in the early 1800s, certainly the 1840s and 1850s, Māori were significant business people, and they began international trade very rapidly, and the tribes were operated very corporate, in a very corporate nature. In the 1860s, we had our colonial wars, the land wars, where we lost about 95% of our land, and it was the start of the big sweeping wave of colonisation that came through our country, as it has in Canada and other countries. So prior to that, our people were very successful business people. Fast forward to 2025, as we as Māori people are trying to gain our feet again in the economy of the country and of the world, there are significant challenges still for us. I love that the Canadian government for a long time have talked about the Indigenous economy as a developing economy within a developed economy. That was coined some time ago by your government, and it's something I've been trying to get our government to accept. And so you have NACA that has been working with Indigenous businesses, providing them with support for many, many years, and doing a fantastic job, and which is why we need a NACA type model in New Zealand to help us lift our Māori business numbers. Mm-hmm. But what is going to allow us to continue to build these businesses so they're going to be effective in trade? Our oldest son, who grew up in Kohanga Reo and Kura Kaupapa Māori, he grew up in his language and his culture, and he's part of this new generation that sees the opportunities of the future. He now works for New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, our government agency that is there to support our business into international markets. And he's in the investment team, and he works predominantly with Māori businesses. I asked him the other day before I came down here what he thought was the biggest challenge for Māori business into the international space. And his one-liner was, our people don't dream big enough. Our people don't dream big enough. I think back in the 1850s and 1840s, there wasn't a problem for our people. But it seems to me that perhaps colonisation has affected us in such deep ways that we still don't dream big enough. And what he's talking to is the issues of scale and the issues of complexity that businesses who dare to move into the international markets will face. And so some of the substantive issues that I hope we cover a little bit more are around the ability of our businesses to scale, around the abilities of our businesses to understand the complexities of international trade and working in multiple markets, moving from a potential market, say here in Canada, of 40 million to a potential market offshore of hundreds and potentially billions of people. So it's not a easy progression for any business, and I've got some thoughts about how we can address that along the way, but those are just a couple of opening points that I'd like to make around what we as Indigenous people and Indigenous businesses should be thinking about. Kia ora.
Thank you very much for that, everyone. That was really helpful in helping us to better understand IPETCA, the benefits of IPETCA, the importance of it being Indigenous-led, and how Indigenous businesses internationally, but also in Canada, can benefit. I want to move on to our next question. So at EDC, we're hearing all about the concerns, just a lot of different types of concerns that Indigenous businesses have when navigating the uncertainty with trade. So, decreased revenues, job losses, the need to diversify markets. Senator Prosper, I'm curious to know, what are some of the challenges and barriers that you're seeing Indigenous businesses face as they explore trade or continue to trade internationally?
Thank you, Donna. And I think we heard a bit about this earlier from the National Chief when she mentioned Canada's loose standards. And there's a need for First Nations to lead the way in terms of authentication and certification of Indigenous businesses, because it's Indigenous people that know their people best, not only from a citizenship perspective, but from a business perspective. So there's a need to ensure that only verified Indigenous businesses are getting the supports, incentives, and set-asides needed for their success. I note that CCIB, the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business, has about 1,258 verified businesses. These are numbers I have in 2023. Indigenous Services Canada has about 2,939 verified businesses, numbers in 2024. But assuming there's no overlap there, that's less than 10% of the 50,000 registered Indigenous businesses that exist. And we all know that this verification process is not foolproof. As mentioned by the National Chief, there is Indigenous identity theft, certainly with respect to government procurement, and it's good to see those avenues being pursued, certainly here within Canada through Indigenous organizations who are leading the way. There has been a parliamentary committee that delved into this. The House, the committee reported to the House its recommendation that companies that engage in Indigenous identity fraud should be barred from accessing any government contracts, and that the committee requests a comprehensive government response. There will be an op-ed that I will publish later in June prior to Indigenous Peoples Day. But it references the excellent work, the co-published work between CCIB and Global Affairs Canada. One of which, as I mentioned earlier, is Adamidowen. And it's excellent research. There was, from what I understand, over 2,600 surveys done on Indigenous businesses, 3 case studies, meetings with numerous EDOs at a community level, which I think is rather key. It highlights key areas which are quite almost like calls to action. The report notes that 61.8% of Indigenous SMEs, small and medium enterprises, Indigenous, face substantial challenges in finding employees with the right skills and qualifications. So there's a need for Canada to work with the Indigenous business community to identify specific skills and training in that regard to fill in those gaps. As well, we all know that there are higher unemployment rates compared within our communities compared to the overall population. There is also insufficient job experience that was noted within that, which hopefully can be remedied by potentially on-site or co-op work experience to give our Indigenous employees the work they really need. Secondly, Indigenous SMEs experience obstacles to assessing finance when growing a business or exporting, especially within Indigenous communities. So again, the need for government to work with financial institutions to find alternatives to traditional lending models in order for these SMEs to secure seed money to scale up operations, as well as capital investment dollars for equipment and business infrastructure. It was also reported that these many smaller businesses find the application and reporting processes for federal funding to be excessively onerous. So there's a need to streamline those application and reporting requirements to help support the already stretched capacity that businesses have to day-to-day operations, to help facilitate better business mentorship as well. Within this report, there was more pronounced obstacles regarding physical and digital infrastructure deficits, particularly online sales exhibited a higher propensity for export with these businesses. In an increasingly digital world, there is a need for fast and reliable internet. That's quite key. The National Chief has mentioned that as well. Certainly, the United Nations has mentioned that, the access to internet as a basic human right, and that quality has to be consistent throughout Canada. Certainly in remote and rural areas, not just the more densely populated areas. So within those remote areas, remoteness more specifically, it was found that it was 65% lower odds of exporting, given the distance to markets, transportation costs, and infrastructure gaps. Also, within Indigenous SME exporters also were almost 4 times more likely to report intellectual property protections as a barrier for exporting than the Canadian average. That certainly exists with businesses involving Indigenous traditional knowledge, which is incorporated into products and services. So there's a need to bring these issues forward, to make government aware of this, and to incorporate protections or exemptions within existing free trade negotiations, and for government to better advocate for these protections within their agreements. IPETCA is a classic example to address the need for more increased people-to-people connections, because it's when you get those dialogues and people coming together, it really makes those issues work for everyone involved. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Those are some really good points. You know, some of the challenges that we're hearing about or that I heard from you were, finding employees, right, with the right skill set, access to capital, but also equitable access to capital, I think, is really important. And I think that's something that the IFIs here do so well with assisting Indigenous entrepreneurs. And then also connectivity and infrastructure. It's really hard to build a business when you don't have sufficient internet access. The world is increasingly, mostly online. And also infrastructure. It's really hard to build a business in your community when you don't have sufficient power or water. So thank you for those great points. Richard, from your perspective in New Zealand, are the challenges and barriers similar, or what are some of the differences?
I think they're very similar. As I said before, I think one of the big issues for all of us as Indigenous businesses, we're a bit late to the party. We're late to the trade party. The trade party's been going on for a century or more, and we've been locked out of it, so we're late to the party. So what does that mean? I think it means we have to be a bit smarter and a bit more strategic about how we support our Indigenous businesses into this space. What does that look like? One of the things I've been promulgating at home is the idea that we do a bit more thinking industry by industry about how we unlock the opportunities in those industries. Some of the collectives that I'm involved with now, we talk about Māori market share. We know how much the proportion of the dairy herd in New Zealand that is Māori owned. We know the proportion of kiwi fruit that is generated that is Māori owned. So what are we going to do about actually building that market share? But within that, what there also is in terms of a big challenge is some of the structural inequities, some of the structural glass ceilings that limit our ability to vertically integrate into some of these industries. So for example, the red meat industry, where I'm doing some work, so that's sheep and beef, big industries, big export industries for New Zealand. Those industries are actually controlled by a cartel of 5 very large processing companies. So we have to think strategically about how we work with, or more likely around and through, the cartel. I mean, these are real structural issues for us. Otherwise, we remain, and we talk about it quite a bit at home, we remain behind the farm gate. And it makes it very, very difficult for us to get up into market, to develop our own brand. And again, this talks back to the scale issues associated with operating in an industry like red meat. I think too that we need to be collectivising and partnering more. We are trying to do that better at home. There have been, again, a function of our history and colonisation that we haven't really gotten on too well together in the past. I think more recently that's starting to improve. The more we can collectivise and partner at home, the more we're going to be able to do at scale. The more we can collectivise and partner across countries as Indigenous people with shared values, long-term intergenerational perspectives, then the better off we will all be and the more effective we will be in international trade. Being strategic, I think, also means, and I think an important point for the teams in the different countries working around IPETCA, is that we need to be a bit smart about how we understand those markets. Certainly for us at home, there are actually 3 parts of the Māori economy. There's the tribal economies, and that only represents 10% of the Māori economy. The second category is Māori landowners, collectives. Those are Māori land trusts and corporations. They operate under the Māori land legislation. They're quite different from the tribes, usually bands or families, but very large controllers of some of the agricultural land and capability, forestry and other holdings. So that's another level of or category of entity that we need to be mindful of. And the third, of course, are the SMEs, the entrepreneurs, which actually represent about 60% of the Māori economy. We have a challenge at the moment, I believe, this is my personal view, in New Zealand, that our tribes are getting better organised, and fantastic to have AFN here, but they're also, from my perspective, post-COVID, they're actually sucking up a lot of the political oxygen in Wellington, in our capital. And I've been trying to encourage our government to ensure that we also address the different and specific needs of those other groups. So it may be here in Canada, perhaps, that tribe to tribe, I think that would be really effective if we develop tribe to tribe opportunities to meet and talk about what those tribal, corporate, multifaceted kinds of businesses might be able to do together. Because what we do find is when tribes come together, they just don't talk about the business opportunities, they talk about language, they talk about culture, they talk about all of the above, social development and all those kinds of things. So it's a particular kind of engagement. And then I think across IPETCA we need to be thinking at the other level, which is what we can do best and how can we focus on the needs of small to medium enterprises and entrepreneurs. So I think some of that thinking has to go on to kind of get us ahead of the game. And again, I think NACA and other organisations, national organisations, have an important role to do that thinking and to help bring us together to work more cooperatively in a more strategic approach to fast track us into the game that we've been out of, and so we can really be part of the party. Kia ora.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. And I really love this idea of the tribe-to-tribe connections, because there is a lot of common ground there. And I think everyone in this audience can understand and relate to the fact that, like, Indigenous business is more than just business and the bottom line. It's community, it's culture, it's all the things that are important to us. I want to shift the conversation now over to opportunities, and I'm keeping mind of the time as well. Listen, tariffs are out there. The uncertainty with tariff threats, tariff announcements, pause on tariffs, it's all creating a bit of a disruption to some of our economies. But with that, there's still, I think, a lot of opportunities that we can look to shift the conversation. Leanne, maybe I'll start with you on this one. What are some of the opportunities that you see or that you think that we can be looking at? Great, thanks.
Certainly Canada is a trading nation. I mean, we all know that. Our economy is based on trade, and it's central to our prosperity and our identity. We have 15 free trade agreements, so opportunities around the world, and Senator Prosper, you mentioned some of them, and we're certainly looking more closely at those and trying to encourage business to look at those. Even though we have CUSMA with the United States and Mexico, or CETA with Europe, many businesses aren't actively using these free trade agreements. So at Global Affairs Canada and the Trade Commissioner Service, we're encouraging more and more businesses to look into those agreements and how to use them effectively. So we've been starting seminars, and we have lots of information online about those free trade agreements and what the benefits are of them. We're also the only G7 country that has free trade agreements with all other G7 member states. So, you know, free trade is really important to Canada, and market diversification certainly is key to that. But of course, the U.S. will always remain an important trading partner for Canada. It's our neighbor, it's a huge economy, and the ties, the people-to-people ties, but also the business linkages over generations is there. And you would have all seen Prime Minister Carney yesterday in Washington, and certainly trade is key. But we need to look at opportunities beyond just the U.S. I wanted to mention that many Indigenous partners, Indigenous businesses and SME exporters are trading with partners around the world. They're looking at Europe, at Asia, Oceania, and Latin America. Africa as well has opportunities. There's been strong interest from Indigenous businesses looking in Oceania, including to capitalize on Indigenous to Indigenous ties. With Australia and New Zealand as part of IPETCA, I hope with increased awareness within Canada, IPETCA can serve as a tool to help businesses begin to make some essential connections to succeed in these markets. And the Indo-Pacific region, of course, is also really important. We have at Global Affairs Canada our embassies and consulates around the globe, and in many of those, most of those, we have trade commissioners, and they're there to help businesses to find new markets, to explore those new economies. So they are really an excellent resource. We have regional offices across Canada as well, where businesses can go to find out about opportunities in the world, and our trade commissioners are there to help and support businesses. We delivered tailored initiatives for Indigenous companies, including business delegations, and that was mentioned that business delegations are really important, and we certainly support that. We have, for example, in 2024, the Trade Commissioner Service collaborated with the Inuit Development Corporation Association to support a delegation of Indigenous businesses to attend the future Greenland Business event and explore opportunities in Arctic mining, infrastructure, fishing, and transportation sectors. Together with our consulate in Sydney, Australia, last August, we worked in collaboration with the Canadian Aboriginal and Minority Supplier Council, CAMC, to lead a delegation to Supply Nation Connect 2024. And that was also a great opportunity to building stronger connections and opening new markets for Indigenous partners. Other government partners like EDC also has excellent resources and supports for Indigenous exporters looking to expand into new markets. So there's lots of information around. We're ready and able to help, and I think the recent tariffs from the U.S. have given us that extra impetus that we need to work further, to look at new markets, but also what the National Chief was saying about internal markets as well, that using Indigenous business, all the opportunities that exist within Canada. I think there's more than enough to do here at home as well. So, but I'll leave it at that because I know we're short on time.
All good. Who knew an hour would go by so quickly? This has been a really engaging conversation. I know there's a lot more, I have more questions, and I know that there's a lot more to say. Maybe we can come back next year and do a part 2. But for now, there's about 5 minutes left. Does anybody have any questions? I want to open up the floor to questions from the audience.
Auntie Dawn, do we have any wireless mics around anywhere? Just over here, that way. There we go. Thank you very, very much. You're good.
Hi there. I think I know everybody on the panel very well. I just wanted to make a couple of points. One is that I know that I've been involved with IPETCA from the beginning and helping to draft the document. And I was wondering when we could have some substantial resources behind it to support those trade missions that we need for the Indigenous to Indigenous trade in the participating countries. I think that's going to be really critical moving forward. And I'm just a little bit worried too about right now. I don't think that we have that many Indigenous businesses in the directory of the Canadian Aboriginal Minority Supplier Council. I don't think we have even any Indigenous people on the board of directors there. So, as we go forward, I think we need to talk about how we work with different entities to support trade. I know I've mentioned, I think to all of you about how we'd like to see the Asian Pacific Foundation of Canada help us, because they already have connections in the Indo-Pacific region to organize trade missions for our people to meet with Indigenous people in those countries as well. So they have an Indigenous working group that I think is coming together, and they're the ones organizing the Indigenous to Indigenous trade right now that'll take place at the World Expo in Osaka, Japan. So they're building some strong relationships. I know some of the business people here who already do trade are planning to participate in that, but they're getting some supports to do that. And that's really needed sometimes to open those doors, even cost sharing and the costs for some of the trade missions and that. But just having somebody organize who they can meet with in those countries, which business sectors are willing to work with our businesses as well, because they don't generally work with retail businesses, but they're looking at maybe the larger manufacturing, IT kinds of businesses. So we need to really help our business people to become trade ready, export ready. And through the Indigenous Financial Institution Network, we really also need to identify which businesses are already involved in export. I know we have a shared database that we use, and I think we need an extra, some changes to that database to help inform or to list or check a box on who's trade ready or who's already doing trade, because there's no database in Canada that lists which Indigenous businesses are involved in trade. We generally know, but we don't have a place that kind of has a database of that information. And I think the IFI network would be a great place to start for that. So that's something for NACA to help us with going forward, and it's a simple change to that database, I think. Anyway, those are just some thoughts and comments I'd like to share with you all. Miigwech.
Thank you. Those are really great comments and heard loud and clear. Absolutely. Resources needed for the necessary Indigenous-led trade missions that are coming up. Does anyone want to speak to that on the panel?
I couldn't agree with you more, Don, that, you know, there's a need for that. At Global Affairs Canada, we have Can Export, which does support trade activities for SMEs and also for associations. Someone was speaking before about how onerous government is. It's an onerous process, but it does work. Working with partners like the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, I think, is really important. And there are others out there. At Expo, as I mentioned, we are working with our other economies and Indigenous peoples for several events, and we will be bringing a delegation with us from our national Indigenous organizations, and, you know, piggybacking on the Asia Pacific Foundation and other businesses that will be there with delegations to try and foster those ties and linkages, because there are so many opportunities, and having those opportunities to be able to speak in person with each other and share is so important and so valuable. So we are looking for opportunities, but you're right, the financial support needs to be greater, and I'm hopeful that, you know, with a new government coming into play, there'll be new priorities and new mandates, and I look forward to seeing what those are. And having people like Senator Prosper in the Senate, you know, pushing for those things, I think is really important as well. Thanks.
Could I just say, I agree totally with some of Dawn's comments. I think one of the great things, I'm a NACA fan. I was given one of these amulets from NACA, and I'm a NACA fan. I've been promoting NACA in New Zealand for a long time. And I think the important thing about NACA is, if you're starting your business, you've got someone by your side through the business journey from start. And I've heard about the stories about clients who've been with the IFIs and AFIs for 10, 20, 30 years in their business journey. For me, moving to the next level for a business into trade, that next step of growth is just another level. And we've heard a lot about the woman in business work that NACA's been doing, the youth initiatives that NACA's taking in that space. So I'd like NACA to maybe consider that their next big strategy is going to be about how they provide support, targeted, focused support to business-ready Indigenous businesses in this country. So that's just a bit of a throw in there.
Maybe I can just add this. The way I see it is, everyone out here that I'm looking at, you're the experts. You know what you need. As mentioned earlier from Don, those comments are well needed, founded, needed, and necessary. So my role through my office as Senator is to support your efforts and to advocate on the issues that you need to be dealt with. I think it's really important to have those connections and to seek out those connections. So, you know, I'm here to try to make that happen. So certainly appreciate all your efforts. Thanks.
Thank you so much, everyone. We're at the end of our session. I want to thank our panelists, Senator Prosper, Leanne, and Richard, all the way from New Zealand. Thank you so much for sharing your insights today and for your support and your information. Some key takeaways really briefly. There's an opportunity for market diversification, right? And trade among Indigenous people in Canada, New Zealand, but also Australia and Taiwan. Let's make some trade missions happen if we could. That would be amazing if they're Indigenous-led. It's important that these initiatives are Indigenous-led. Indigenous people have the knowledge, the experience, the expertise to lead and contribute in a meaningful way. And lastly, I know, there's been lots of conversations late in the news and in communities to support Canadian companies. remember, to buy Indigenous is to buy Canadian, and there's no better place to start than out there in the Indigenous prosperity market. There's some incredible artisans, some really nice beadwork. Girls, you need to get your earring game on. Let's get some medallions all on everybody and pins. So thank you again for your time. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, Donna.
Very nice, very nice.